So we have Professor Roberto Lewis-Fernandez, who is in the waiting room, waiting to begin his presentation. Professor Fernandez will be talking today about cultural concepts of distress. And so I want to hand the floor over to Professor Fernandez. Go right ahead, sir, and thank you for your patience.
My presentation is on this impact of sociocultural context on illness experience, focusing on traumatic exposure. The main point I would like to leave you with, and I think what I'll do is I'll skip through some of the slides, but my main point is that attention to a person's sociocultural context, the life world in which they live, can really help understand how they express their concerns and enhance the assessment for clinical purposes. And I think this follows nicely from the last conversation about sticking very closely to the way people actually speak and being true to their identity and forms of communication. I think this is very similar in spirit to that presentation. This is the topics that I would cover. I won't go through them for the interest of time, and I'll cover some of them more than others. First, what is culture, so that we all get on the same page? And the main point that I wanted to make in this slide, I'll just click through the slides to the end, is the clicks to the end, is the idea that culture isn't static, and it's not something that belongs to other people, but rather it's a process. It's the process of making meaning of life, of the world, making sense of experience, and then behaving accordingly. That process is what we call culture. And it's not idiosyncratic to ourselves alone, because we never make meaning just out of nowhere. We make meaning, or of our own invention, we invent things on the basis of what we've learned. And what we've learned are traditions of meaning and interpretation and social structures, ways in which the world is composed, built, society, laws, institutions, everything. It leads us to make sense of the world in given ways. We all do this. It varies by different engagements that we have with different social groupings in the world by virtue of age, gender, sexual orientation, national origin, race, ethnicity, religion, language, on and on, class, on and on and on. So it's always very complicated, very mixed, combined. Hybrid is a word that's being used these days. Intersectional positioning. And therefore, it does a disservice to understanding culture. We think of it as something simple, like just where they come from or what race or ethnicity they might be seen to be, but rather it's this complicated process that varies from moment to moment, keeps getting recreated and changed. And therefore, the best way to understand somebody's cultural behavior, background, experience, understanding is to engage them, because most of these experiences are out of awareness. We behave as if they were completely natural, normal. Doesn't everybody think this way? Whereas in fact, they're constructed ways of making sense of the world that vary from place to place and person to person and moment to moment. And if we really want to engage, in community to community, because it's also a group thing, not just an individual thing. And so we want to make sure we understand it by engaging people about their views. That's the bottom line, and their practices. So that leads to the discussion of what's a cultural concept of distress. And it's just the way, it's a fancy way of talking, it's a recent way of talking about the ways that people experience, understand, and communicate suffering, behavioral problems, or troubling thoughts and emotions. It's the way we express our concerns, including things that are considered illnesses in psychiatric or psychological or mental health work. So they're all constructed on the basis of our biology and our social, adversities in our life and our temperaments and any number of things. And they follow patterns, but they're not exactly the same everywhere. And they communicate experience and messages by the way we express our illnesses. They express even how we understand what the illness is, what aspects seem more salient. And we all do this. And it's not only symptoms, but also behaviors and ways in which we talk about symptoms and behaviors and so on. So all of these are the ways we talk about distress and suffering and illness. And those ways are important to understand. They're not static and they vary from place to place. And they can be cataloged as different ways of talking about them. I won't belabor this in great length, but you could either have more general languages or idioms, behaviors. Smoking can be an idiom of distress when you're upset. Drinking is an idiom. Drinking alcohol is an idiom of distress, but also other ways of talking. Nervios, the language, I'm from Puerto Rico originally, the language of nerves is a whole language of distress that has many nuances. You can see some of them rising up in the real world. For example, in the US, among the medical profession and in general in society, there's a whole discussion now on burnout. Burnout is a whole language of suffering that people are now, it's becoming real, a thing, if you will. We see that happening. They emerge, they become important. Nervous breakdown is another. Speaking of depression, as in the general popular way of speaking about depression, not necessarily the psychiatric manual, but just the way people speak about being depressed. These are all idioms. And they're not necessarily linked to specific signs and symptoms. They're more general ways of expressing distress that the psychiatrists, psychologists, and so on tend to try to label and classify, but in the popular life, they are more diverse. And similar for explanation, causes. Stress is a cultural cause. Spirits is it's caused by the influence of the spirits of the people who are deceased. These are explanations for origins of distress. Or chemical imbalance is another cultural explanation. And then there are syndromes where they run together: symptoms, explanations, expectations of care, prognostic hopes and fears, what's going to happen to me. These are all part of syndromes like those in the psychiatric manual that have been distilled over time into these forms, but they run together in terms of these characteristics in a more stereotyped way. It's important to keep them in mind, just because if you're trying to address an explanation with a diagnosis, you can get confused very quickly and you don't know why the person is speaking of causes when you're trying to speak of symptoms, for example. So it's important to keep the different ways of expression in mind. And there are also other reasons, because people can express these conditions when they don't fulfill criteria for abnormal health, for psychopathology. They can just be normal reactions. I'll show you a normal reaction in a video. They also engage with what to do about it, so-called idioms of resilience. So they can be very helpful in psychotherapy if you know that a certain kind of idiom of distress, like nerves, is expected to be addressed by a certain kind of resilience or control or reaction, or, in Spanish, doing your share of effort. Poner de su parte. All these, it's helpful to know these connections in order to work with people where they're at. And that's why they can hide self-seeking. So there are many uses. I won't belabor them. There are many uses. A big one that I like to mention, many uses to why pay attention to this. Why pay attention to the way people speak? Why can't we just go by the diagnosis in our manual? There are many reasons. Conceptually, for one thing, you realize by talking about the different ways that people experience distress, that the ways people experience distress are in some ways constructed. And there isn't a single reality that we as clinicians need to impose on our patients. Oh, no, you're wrong, you're ignorant, and you don't know how you're suffering. No, everybody has a different way. They're all equally valid. They all have advantages and disadvantages. Ours can be very medicalized, decontextualizing, stigmatizing. I mean, ours as in psychiatrists, as I am. The persons can be very inclusive, but sometimes they lead to rejection from society. So there's ways in which it can be. We need to understand the advantages and disadvantages of all these different forms of expression. And clinically, for the person, they sometimes act as good markers. The person speaks a certain language, and if you can translate it into a professional set of classifications, you get to understand and not misunderstand, for example, the misdiagnosis part. If the person speaks about spiritual causation, and we think only people who have schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders speak about spiritual causations because they're supernatural and they're not real, and so that's our narrow attitude, then we will be much more likely to misunderstand them, and especially given the implicit bias that many people in the United States have about lots of people, but especially people with darker skin, then we are much more likely to misdiagnose them in a systematic way. There's all sorts of reasons, improving communication, rapport, engagement, etc., that I will not belabor. It's important to speak the person's language. It goes very closely connected to the discussion we just had about Creolese. So trauma, I'll talk about traumatic reactions now as an example of this kind of points that I was making. First, I just want to make the point that reactions to trauma and traumatic experiences that are terrible, overwhelming, very distressing, are these reactions to these experiences are very, very diverse. We should not have the idea that there's only one kind of reaction to trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, or something like that, and that's it. No, no. Traumatic experiences, as those of you who have lived or who are clinicians in the audience know, can be incredible diverse. People can respond with growth and resilience and endurance. It can be terrible, but very positive for the person. There's strict trauma reactions. There's other psychopathology, so to speak, including substance misuse as a response to trauma, as well as all these other experiences, idioms related to trauma that I have there listed below. These are just the multiplicity of reactions to trauma. I wanted to open that way, and then speak about this topic about conditional risk of PTSD, which can vary so that different forms of trauma may be more or less likely in different contexts and people to cause them to develop an abnormal, if you will, a maladaptive reaction, or a reaction that at first is distressing, but becomes healthy and leads to growth over time. Essentially, the idea being that different contexts, people, and cultural environments, as well as types of trauma, may be associated with different levels of reaction, in this case, of types or severities of post-traumatic stress symptoms. And I wanted to give you an illustration of this. I like this slide because it's, to me, very clear, and it addresses language and ethnic background, ethno-racial background. What this shows is the probability on the vertical axis of meeting criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder given a certain symptom scale. And what the horizontal or x-axis show, the low, moderate, and high, is levels of trauma after a hurricane in Florida in 1992. They studied people in reactions to the hurricane, and they classified them low, moderate, high in terms of personal trauma on whether their life or their belongings were threatened by the hurricane. And low if they had neither threat to life or belongings, moderate if they had either one, and high if they had both. And what you see, and then the colors are different ethno-racial linguistic groups. So non-Hispanic white folks in Florida, non-Hispanic Black folks, and then Hispanic or Latino folks who speak Spanish. There were very few English-speaking Latinos to separate them out. And what you see is when the level of trauma is low, the proportion of meeting PTSD does not vary by these groups. They're about the same. But as the proportion of the extent of trauma rises, you see that the groups spread out. And the reason they spread out, according to some of the study, the data they had, they didn't have all the data in the world. Racism and discrimination, for example, is a major cause of this that isn't necessarily included. Previous childhood trauma, etc. They may not have addressed all the necessary factors, but some of the ones they did address that were positive, for example, that explained a lot of the, enough of the variance, as they call the variability in the responses, had to do with a sense of fatalism, that these things, you weren't in control of events. That was associated with a negative post-traumatic reaction. And another one was that you were suffering from a culturative stress. There were difficulties in your establishment in the society, in your connections with other ethno-racial groups in the place, partly due to your difficulty belonging in that society. So those people with fatalistic and culturative stress experiences were more likely to develop PTSD. So this is just an example, I'm sure there could be others, of ways in which the conditional probability of PTSD, in this case, after high exposure to a hurricane, might have a different reaction in different people because of their different environments and experiences. Another reason that PTSD may differ has to do, and I won't belabor this, about the reactions that people have in response to the trauma. And these are data from different kinds of folks that after 9/11 in Manhattan, police that encountered duty-related trauma. And they found that having a panic attack that is associated with the traumatic event, around the event, you have a panic attack. This is actually a risk factor for post-traumatic stress disorder after the event. It has to do with the loss of control and the terrible experience of having a panic reaction to an event. And here, I just wanted to show you a little bit of evidence about this syndrome. I don't know how there are any cognates, forgive me, in Guyana, but in the Hispanic Caribbean, there's this syndrome of attack of nerves where the person has a fit of acute emotionality that is experienced as being out of control. And it could be any number of intense emotions. And it's really a sign of being overwhelmed by what's happening and needing support. And it usually follows a stressor. Some of the time, the reaction is considered and is quite normal in the sense that it doesn't have negative sequelae. They don't become a psychiatric patient afterwards. They just have a very intense, say, grief reaction. But it can be a predisposing element to later problems if adversity keeps happening and the person keeps feeling out of control in this way. If the person is consistently overwhelmed, it's a bad prognosis because the attack, what it's doing is it's showing a gap between the adverse experiencing and their coping ability. They're constantly being overwhelmed in this way. And I wanted to show you what would probably be considered a normal ataque in the Dominican Republic where this was filmed. And this happens, you'll hear the voice of the BBC announcer, in fact, in the background. And it's a video somebody took of a man having a nervous attack, an ataque de nervios, in Santo Domingo Airport, just when he heard that an airplane, you may remember in 2001, there was a big crash of an airplane in Queens. It took off from John F. Kennedy Airport and crashed right into the bay there in Queens. Everybody died on board. It was heading to the Dominican Republic. So this man has just heard his brother has died on the plane, and this is his attack.
At Santo Domingo Airport, scenes of grief at the loss of so many loved ones. This man was one of those who'd come to meet relatives or friends, only to be told they would never arrive. About 175 passengers were from this Caribbean country. Oh my God, he said, it can't be. My mother has heart trouble and this will kill her. I came to pick up my brother. He was on the plane.
So you see, I hope you heard that. It's thank you to the tech people in Guyana who really helped magnify the sound. We've been trying to magnify the sound for years, and they were able to do it. I'm very thankful. But you see, this was a reaction, a peritraumatic attack upon hearing this event that may be a cultural experience. People, you notice that people around him were quite aware of what was going on. There wasn't any, oh my God, what's wrong with this man, and shying away. They knew what to do. They were calm. They surrounded the man. They helped. They supported. They heard him out. This is a cultural reaction to a sudden death event. And it may have no sequela, or it may have, if it's problematic in terms of continuing sequela, continuing problems because of the death, continual events happening. And it's more common in women than in men. This is an attack in a man, but it's also not uncommon among men, and it has a very high prevalence in the Hispanic. This is among Latinos in the United States. The range is different. Latino groups, Puerto Ricans have the highest number there. So just very briefly, this slide is here to tell you that it's not just a panic attack, that it has different kinds of symptoms. The ones in black are like panic disorder kinds of symptoms, but then there are others that are sort of becoming less like panic, more like something else. very strong dissociative symptoms. These are data from people with ataque de nervios reporting their symptoms spontaneously in Puerto Rico. So they don't follow a scale. They are what happened during your first ataque, and people tell you, and then we classify them. And then they sometimes breaking or attacking things or people, and even trying to kill themselves. 1 out of 7 people tried to kill themselves during their first attack or other symptoms. So it's a reaction that may or may not have to do with psychopathology and may or may not have to do with panic attacks or other disorders. I could show you data about that. I didn't include it for the interest of time, but it's different than panic disorder. Only about 17% of the people in one clinic of ours here in New York met full criteria for panic disorder when they presented with their ataque de nervios. So only 1 out of 6 or so had that experience. But it matters because here these data tells you that actually, if they answer yes on a lifetime basis to ever having one of these, they're more likely, that's what the 2.25, 2.4, 2.2 means, their odds, higher odds, probabilities of meeting criteria for mental health related disability ideation, suicidal ideation, use of outpatient care, even after you adjust or account for the impact of all these factors down below, including income, education, traumatic exposure, etc. So by itself, this reaction is a marker of being overwhelmed that may have to do with a dissociative mechanism, being a disconnection between the person in their typical experience, either their memory dysfunction or a depersonalization or things where they don't feel real or the world doesn't feel real, the disruptions of consciousness. This is common during ataque. These are qualitative data on that. These are quantitative data, meaning this shows that the more ataques you have among Puerto Rican women seeking outpatient care in the New England area, the more ataque you have, the bars on the right, the orange bar, if you will, the more likely you are to endorse these experiences, both symptoms and diagnoses of dissociative disorder. So you are overwhelmed. It causes you to lose memory, to come out of yourself, if you will. This is a typical type of experience that if you want to talk about it, we can, but it has to do essentially with the way in which, in my experience, folks in the Hispanic Caribbean and other places make sense of the world through this sense of control that they want to, they value remaining equanimitous, remaining tranquil, no matter what their circumstances. This is what a mature person does. And what a discontrolled event is, like this ataque, it's a signal that you cannot maintain that social position, that the world has lost cohesion. And it's gendered because women are held to higher standards of this idea of control. They're supposed to be more controlled than men, and all these. And these are all very important notions, social notions, to consider when using these ideas in carrying out psychotherapy with people who have had traumatic experiences, who have essentially been overwhelmed over and over. And you need to refer to these cultural knowledge, if you will, in order to help them reassemble a world that makes sense. It's an idiom. In this case, it's a syndrome because it's a stereotype. There are certain patterns. You saw the symptom percentages. Those are typically how the disorder is. The expression is there are different variations, but typically it's stereotyped. And so you want to understand what that is, not get confused in a diagnostic situation, not call it something that it isn't. It isn't necessarily panic. It may or may not respond to panic like psychotherapy and medications. You have to take it for what it is and understand it in its own context. Sometimes they overlap psychiatric categories, but that's the process of translation that you would want to do. Some ataques are like panic disorder, I said 17%. Others are more like grief reactions or other dissociative experiences or other trauma-related experiences. And you would want to take this expression and translate it into your professional approach, whatever it is, in order to help the person. So a way to do that, I will not go into this. I wasn't going to, I was just going to show you this is a cultural formulation interview. Those of you who heard my presentation in this conference last year know that I discussed this. It's just a systematic way of obtaining information from the person about their views and that of their family and friends about what it is that brings them to care. So in conclusion, I hope I've shown you how sociocultural context shapes all kinds of illness experience, including trauma reactions, how there's a key role for meaning traditions and social environments, how there's a broad range of trauma-related symptoms and mechanisms, and the value of assessing and understanding all of this when you're trying to help somebody through it. So now here's my email if anybody wants to email me comments. Just if we have a few minutes for question and answers, that would be great for general discussion. It's up to you because I know we're a little bit over the time.
Thank you, Dr. Fernandez. I think that was a quite interesting presentation as well. Lots of data, lots of good information. I think certainly persons in the audience may have questions that they want to ask, and get answers for. But one of the things I want to comment on is the cultural aspect of trauma, how trauma is represented in different cultures. And as I saw the gentleman reacting to the news of his brother's death, I was telling Dr. Yamar, this is every guy's funeral. He would have lots of data if he comes down here and visits funerals in Guyana, because that's how, it translates across cultures in some regards. Of course, in other places, people are proper and nobody's going to be throwing down themselves at funerals unless they collapse, over intense emotion at the moment. But this expressiveness, I don't expect to go to an English funeral and see this. It will be sobbing and patting their eyes very gently and so. But in Guyana, we don't do that. We let the emotions fly wherever they will. I remember my cousin who we were going to a funeral, and so she was there and she said, because I might get emotional and I want you to support me. My cousin is several times my size, and I said no. It was raining, the ground was wet. I wasn't planning to support her either. So she understood that she couldn't express herself fully, at least, expecting support from me there, because we would have both been on the But the point is that understanding trauma in the culture is what is important, I believe. So you go somewhere else and the person may not necessarily express themselves to that full extent, but they're expressing themselves nevertheless. To understand the cultural context is important, especially for those people who work in different settings. You move from setting to setting and you work. So definitely, I think it was a very interesting presentation. Do we have questions from the audience? Please don't be shy.
Just in the case that presenter showed us with the last cycle, the way they reacted to hurricane and in that their stress level was a lot higher. Okay? Not only are you dealing with different culture there, you're dealing with foreigners living in a foreign land where it could be a little bit unsettled, bewildered as to the norms of that country. They haven't fully, they don't really feel that they're included in them. So they are in a strange place. And that too could have come with their level of stress.
Yeah.
Apart from the cultural aspect.
Certainly, yeah.
Could you actually repeat the question, please, or the comment, or at least the summary of it?
So basically, the comment was that for those persons who were surviving Hurricane Andrew, they were foreigners in a different cultural setting, so that there was one level of stress there adapting, and then they had this tragic event. So the stress level was much higher. So they were responding more than just the hurricane itself and the effects thereof, but also to adapting to a new cultural situation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The questions, however, were specifically about the impact of the hurricane. So
right.
That's interesting that yes, absolutely, the person's whole context affected their reaction to the hurricane, but the questions were purposefully patterned so that they're supposed to be answering about the impact of the hurricane.
Mm-hmm. Right. So even I think what the commenter was also pointing out, that even though they were responding to the effects of the hurricane, there was some subliminal, at least, trauma or stress that was being brought over from their presence as foreigners in this land. And so I think what she's saying is that their responses were still colored by the preceding trauma. Yes?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That is, I was addressing that point, but only to remind people that the questions were not general. They're questions about the effect of the hurricane. So it proves the point of the commentator is making, that, and in fact, they looked at the acculturative stress, just how difficult was their adaptation to the place. And they found that difficult adaptation was associated with higher scores on the stress response to the hurricane.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, I want to thank the presenter for this particular presentation, because when I was looking at the culture of stress, I am relating it to my experience here in Guyana as a practitioner for over 11 years. And as a practitioner, what I find with this culture of distress and trauma is the after effect. When persons come in, or clients come in, because of some trauma that may have taken place in the past, what I have found though is compounded trauma that they would be experiencing, and it becomes overwhelming. And how do they communicate that? The pain, the suffering, the behavior, that was the connect for me in the presentation. But I saw that, not necessarily because I'm going here, not even here close to any kind of hurricane, but yet the impact of trauma is felt within the society. What I also want to share is my experience also is that in the assessment process, I have had to tweak it to some point, and even these days I use the person and environment also instrument to aid me in uncovering this, because the symptoms and the signs, you see, it's collecting those symptoms and the signs. And I am seeing that persons are reporting a lot of signs and not the symptoms, but yet they're being diagnosed, you see, with some kind of mental disorder. So, it's mind-boggling to me. So I appreciate this because it speaks to that culture of distress. I've also found that the distress between one group may be very different from the distress of another group. But here in our society, we're trying to put everybody in the same pot. And we're not looking that in the Indo-Guyanese community, their communication pattern, the stress levels that they may be encountering in their own personal lives is very different from another group, from, I would say, the Amerindians or the indigenous group or the Afro-Guyanese group. But yet we as practitioners, when we are not sensitive to our clients, even our clients of mixed ethnicity, that they may have been rejected from one group and then here they are reassigned, to the other ethnic group, and then they're having these cultural distresses. How do we explain this? How do we, communicate what we're experiencing inside before we are even given medication and allow antidepressants? Oh, you shouldn't be feeling the way you feel. You need something to make you feel better. This has been my experience in the field here in Guyana. And I appreciate this culture of distress, because it really and truly confirms what I've been seeing on the ground. And to be in a forum like this, to be able to share that level and in-depth insight of what I have encountered here in the field. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those comments.